Well, I'm Minister Philpott. Welcome to APTN National News.
Thanks for having me.
We'll start off with the year has ended kind of on a tragic note, especially in Thunder Bay with now we know as the murder of Braden Jacob. A while ago you said significant investments had been made in his community in a media scrum. But why did this young man still have to go to Thunder Bay all by himself?
Well, I want to also acknowledge that it's been a very difficult couple of weeks for the Thunder Bay community and Anishinaabe Nation, and of course Webikwe specifically. In terms of the specific details of why this young man had to go for his counseling or treatment in Thunder Bay, I'm not familiar with the details of the case. The reality is, as I said, yes, we've made very large investments in mental wellness and Jordan's Principle, the Choose Life program, etc. Sadly, that doesn't actually address the deep roots of why someone like this would have experienced such a tragedy. It's a terrible story. It speaks to the vulnerability of Indigenous youth in the cities of this country, and it speaks to how we have to do so much better to address all of the root causes of why he ended up in that circumstance.
Does an escort need to be funded to start going with young people who go to Thunder Bay?
Well, as you know, we do support having someone to accompany people when they travel for health reasons on a case-by-case basis in some cases, but we know that there is funding there for those. As I say, I don't know the specific details of who may or may not have wanted to travel with him. This is a really, really important case, though, because, of course, we hope that it is going to be properly investigated so that we will get the right answers that we need to get to the root causes of how this happened and to try to make sure that this never happens again. It's happened far too many times in this community. And as I say, I think the more that we understand of what took place, the more that we can make sure that we are getting those supports, making sure that young people in Thunder Bay and other cities across the country are safe, protected, not discriminated against, and not targeted.
I'm going to move on to housing. I know you said on many times that lack of quality housing underlies a lot of health problems in particular. I know you've announced many projects over the past year, for example, over $1 million for 6 units in the Beausoleil First Nation here in Ontario, for example. But couldn't more housing be built for that amount of money?
Well, we have made significant progress in housing. I believe at last count we're at about 15,000 homes that have been built or had major renovations on reserve. We know there's still a very large gap there. We have made significant investments in housing, not only for First Nations on reserve, but also large investments in housing for Inuit and for the Métis Nation as well. There is much more to do to address the gap, not just for housing, but for other infrastructure, and we're investing in schools and health centers and roads, as well as making sure that we do better in the area of operations and maintenance. I think we have made important progress, and I hear across the country of what's happened, and then that literally hundreds of communities across the country that have built new houses over the last 3 years. But there's more work to be done. We acknowledge that, and we're working with the Assembly of First Nations and other national Indigenous organizations to find out how we can do better and faster.
What about the provinces? I know the province of BC has made a significant investment on their own for an Indigenous housing strategy. What has the federal government done, I guess, about getting other provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, for example, to do the same kind of thing?
Well, you're absolutely right that it is something that we have to work on collaboratively with provinces and territories, specifically for urban housing needs. And I really do salute the work of British Columbia, that they have taken some of the funding that came not from my department but from Infrastructure Canada. We made very large investments as a federal government for infrastructure in every single province and territory. We hope that that provinces and territories will allocate a portion of that to a specific urban Indigenous housing strategy in a similar fashion to what British Columbia has done. We are continuing to have those conversations, as is my counterpart, the Minister of Infrastructure, to make sure that a healthy portion of infrastructure investments recognizes the needs of Indigenous peoples, and including in remote areas.
Have you or your counterpart actually sat down with the premier of those provinces I mentioned and really asked them to do the same thing as BC?
Well, we do meet with our counterparts on a regular basis. I know the Minister of Infrastructure meets with his counterparts and talks specifically about these things. I use every opportunity I have when I'm with ministers from the provinces and territories to talk about how we can work together better. We're seeing some good examples of that in a number of places. Of course, the really fantastic example we're also proud of is Wataynikaneyap Power in Northern Ontario that is very soon going to bring clean hydroelectric power to Pikangikum, and then after that to another 16 First Nations in the north. Projects like that have to be encouraged, and we hope that more provinces will step up.
Water, I know that I believe you're more than halfway to your goal of getting rid of water advisories by 2021, I believe is the date. These are public systems, of course. What about water quality on First Nation where there's a lot of private systems? Maybe they draw water from their wells. I know there are especially the Iroquois nations here in this area do have a lot of private systems.
Well, thanks for raising the issue. We have made progress that we're pleased about in working in collaboration with First Nations leadership. We've now seen the lifting of 76 long-term drinking water advisories for public systems on reserve and 65 more to go. That includes, of course, health clinics, community centers, schools, etc., all of the water that serves public systems that is then distributed out to homes from there. There are other drinking water advisories, for instance, on when we talk about private systems, we're talking about things like a gas station, perhaps, or a convenience store that might be located on reserve, and we do know that they have boil water advisories that we hope that they will address as well. The issue around making sure it gets out to every home is a challenge that we are also addressing. We made a big investment this year at Six Nations, for example, who didn't necessarily have an issue with the actual system, but it was not distributed out to the community. We're doing similar kind of work with the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and have supported them in a number of water projects. So you're right, there's more to do than just lifting the advisory on those systems. That's a big, important step in the right direction. To take it from there and make sure it actually gets distributed well is work that we are also proceeding with.
Now, I'm not sure if this comes under Indigenous Services, but I know a lot of Indigenous people would like to know when will it be easier to get a new status card?
Well, there is work being done in that particular area, and we're doing service improvement in a number of areas. I'd be happy to provide folks with more details on that as those new initiatives become available. But for instance, in our Winnipeg office, where we often hear of a lot of requests, there's significant process improvements that are underway, and that is definitely something that we are paying attention to.
Shouldn't there be a day, I guess, when you could go to Service Canada and get it as quickly as you get a driver's license, for example?
Well, I would like to see that it would be even easier than that, and we are certainly working on mechanisms. For example, there are new technologies that are becoming available so that you don't have to, that you can actually use your phone to be able to take the photograph that's required and be able to upload that. So there is work being done to improve it, and I think we've made some progress so far, but it's definitely an area where there's more to come.
So water, health, housing, child welfare, we're going into an election year, of course. There's not much time left. So what is the top priority for your department as we head to next October?
There are multiple priorities, so it's hard to choose one specifically, but if I can just point to, you talked about child welfare, and you may know that we've recently announced that we will be going forward to table legislation that addresses issues around child and family services for Indigenous children. This is a really important piece of work. This is work that we have co-developed in collaboration with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and it is going to lay a mark in time to say very loudly and clearly to everyone, this has got to change. No more taking children away from their families, no more scooping. We need to find ways to support families, to prevent the apprehension of children, and to get children back home.
Of course, will it get passed by next October? I guess is the big question. I mean, I've seen legislation sail through in a matter of months, and then something like Bill C-21, which just got royal assent, the one introduced by the Public Safety Minister, Mr. Goodell, took 2 years. So I guess, what's the difference? Like, what do you have to get to ensure that this piece of legislation gets through?
Well, I am determined to do everything within my power to be able to move this along. Where I feel confident is the fact that this is a piece of legislation that has been co-developed. We have had consensus across the country in terms of support from First Nations, Inuit and Métis about why this is important and what needs to be in the legislation. I've heard good, positive signals from both the Conservatives and the New Democratic Party that, of course, they support keeping families together. And the senators are really, really interested in this bill. I've met with Senator Sinclair and a whole range of Indigenous senators who are quite enthusiastic about this. I really hope that it will move through quickly.
Well, we'll have to see. Again, Minister Philpott, once again, thank you for dropping by and doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Back to you in Winnipeg.